How did you discover the metaphysics?
First of all, as far as lived experience is concerned, you're talking about a fairly lengthy period of time. It's like, more than a decade for sure, closer to 20 years. Um, and so, in effect, I can say that I discovered Axiom 1 first. And around that time, I was thinking a lot about things like semiotics and the relationship between sign and symbol and how we distinguish between sign and symbol. But there's a whole lot of other stuff that was going on at the same time. I was thinking a lot about computer science. I was thinking about cosmology. It's hard to say definitively which of these things I was exploring resulted in the insight. But I do remember there was a moment where I was sitting in the window of my rented apartment, a room. I was at the University of Maine at Farmington at the time. I don't know what year, but I was looking out the window and a thunderstorm had rolled in, and there was a moment when the lightning struck pretty close to where I was looking. Right, I just happened to be looking in that direction, and in that moment, that brief instant of time, it occurred to me to think about the lightning bolt as being more basic than both the ground and the sky, and that was in a certain sense, it sounds figurative, but there's a literalness to that, right? Because in effect, there's when we think about lightning, it's a charge flow. There's an electron process happening there, and the notion of atomic structure of solidness is an electron process. So in that sense, it's not actually figurative for me to say that the lightning bolt as an electric process is literally the very basis of what solidness is. Right? The fact that I can't push my two hands through one another or drop my hands or fall through the floor, or that solidness is a thing, is an electric phenomenon. And, so in that sense, however those concepts came together, there was a recognition that, I needed to treat relationship as more fundamental than thingness. And that concept completely reorganized how I thought about every other topic that I knew. And that went on for several years. And then at a certain point, I was trying to work out some pretty elaborate network equations. I was trying to understand something about how gradients would allow us to describe essentially a kind of projection of the notion of substance. But without going into the details of the network theory and the particular way I was constructing it, I was noticing this sort of problem where if I calculated it one sense, I'd get one answer. And if I calculated it a different way, I'd get a different answer. And of course, I was trying to figure out, why the heck is that happening? Am I making some mistake? Is there something wrong with the way the calculations are being done? Or is there some assumption that is true in one case and isn't in the other? And it turned out to be that there was such an assumption. And the assumption is that, as we now formulate it, that the omniscient and the transcendent are the same concept, but they're not. And so, in effect, that was the origin of what has now become Axiom 3. It was essentially a realization that for every content, there are two distinct kinds of context. And so to sort of label those two distinct kinds of context, I called one of them omniscient and the other transcendent, because that captured the closest notion of why I was distinguishing these two different kinds of context. So if the relationship was content, how do I hold the notion of context? Like what is the methods by which I do that? I see the question about three contexts. That's actually a whole other topic. We'll cover that some other day. And so in effect, what we're getting to is how did Axiom 2 arise? One of the things that sort of emerged and again, many years passed from the time that Axiom 3 was figured out to, understanding how that filtered and affected everything that I understood from that point. There was a point subsequent to that where I had effectively, I described this as a kind of, imagine you've got a box and it has a door on both sides and a conveyor belt that goes through. And you put a chicken, I'm just picking this because it's the metaphor I usually use. You put a chicken on one end and the door opens and it goes through the box on the conveyor belt, and then the door closes, some magic happens, and then the door opens up on the other side and the chicken comes out on the conveyor belt. And what does the box do? Well, the box makes a more perfect chicken, right? So in effect, what I was doing is I was taking concepts and I was putting it through this reifying process, and there's a whole bunch of stuff about how that works. But I was essentially running a reifying process on structures of concepts and structures of relationships of concepts, and it would create a more perfect version of those concepts. And there were certain structures that were converging to a kind of idealized form. So axiom 2 essentially was the calculus of the convergent limit of that perfected form. And I know that this sounds very abstract, and it kind of is, but essentially I had learned how to essentially move back and forth between the fully uh, fully first person and fully third person. There was a sense in which those isomorphisms were not um, that those structures that essentially were entering more perfect forms was a kind of distillation. And um, it wasn't just in an abstract way. It was essentially a kind of calculus of being at that point. And this gets elaborate because the kind of meditative states I was essentially constructing at that particular point are not the usual fare. I'll just put it that way. Um, but in a sense, what ended up happening is that axiom 2 emerged out of that, and then convergence of the self-describing nature of the metaphysics emerged out of that, and the self-describing of the description of the process of being self-describing emerged out of that, more or less all at the same time. And so in effect there was a kind of closure, there was a kind of loop where in effect the full embodiment of the metaphysics was then realized. um, and I survived. So that's that question.